Hello, everybody, and welcome to an extra episode of the Left Wing Podcast. Will Slattery here with you. And we covered plenty of topics on Tuesday, but one thing we didn't get to delve into in too much detail was, I suppose, the state of Joe Schmidt's Australia team. It's been a very busy year for the Wallabies. Obviously, the Lions Test Series, then Rugby Championship, then straight into their Northern Hemisphere tour. I think this game against Ireland will be their 14th test. So they have played 13 so far. They've won 5 and lost 8. So it's been a mixed year of results. Some performances have been really good. The second Lions Test, that win in South Africa. Some performances have been not so good. Losing to Italy last weekend, the worst possible preparation ahead of this Ireland game. So I wanted to get someone, an expert from Australia, to discuss it with. And I'm going to be joined in just a minute by Christy Doran from theroar.com. Very good Australian rugby journalist. He's also on ESPN Scrum Reset podcast, kind of like an Australian Rory O'Connor. Think of him like that, a good punchy journalist who has his finger on the pulse. I recorded with him just before the Australian team announcement yesterday, and we actually started off by discussing kind of the farcical situation where the Australian team is being named at 1:30 in the morning Australian time. Australian media there's only one Australian journalist who's come up from Australia for this Northern tour, obviously signed to the Times and the media. It's a long way to travel. So all the kind of Australian press pack are pretty much covering it from Australia. And yet Joe Schmidt is doing his press conference at 1:30 in the morning, which I suppose shows his relationship with the media still exists. Maybe a little bit of tension there. So I got into it with Christy about the direction of the Wallabies looking ahead to the World Cup, the battle for hearts and minds in Australia, Rugby League obviously very popular as well. And as I said, started off with just a little discussion about what it's like covering Joe Schmidt's Wallabies. So let's hear from Christy. Christy Doran, welcome to the show.
Hey, glad to join you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I didn't get to talk a huge amount of Wallabies earlier in the week, so I really wanted to delve into it with you ahead of kick-off on Saturday night. And by way of starting off, it's a funny one. So we're recording this a little bit before the Australian team announcement, which is completely normal time of day for us over in Ireland, 2:00. But for Australian journalists like yourself, and I understand I think Jonathan Drennan is the only guy who's in the Northern Hemisphere for the tour. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. There's actually an Australian-based journalist in London called Jacqueline Magnay who's over for the week as well. But for one of my former colleagues. But yeah, just the two of them are there.
Yeah, so the team announcement for you guys is 1:30 in the morning Sydney time, and Joe is doing his press conference then. Like, talk about trying to grow the game. I was looking at your Twitter account earlier, and you had a piece about the team, and the first comment was like, Jesus, Christy, like, what's going on with this team announcement? And it strikes me as well, it's kind of a strange thing. I thought that maybe the Wallabies would name their team, at this time of day and a bit earlier, so they can have an actual discussion with their journalists. Is this Joe Schmidt deliberately trying to kind of avoid us journalists like yourself, asking them harsh questions, or what's going on there? It seems a kind of a bit of a two fingers to the Australian media.
It's probably a twofold response. This isn't unusual that an announcement would be late, the official announcement, but in the past, Dave Rennie, one of Joe Schmidt's compatriots from New Zealand, would reveal the team to the journalists at 6:00, 6 p.m. local Australian time, and the team would be embargoed. It wouldn't be released for a few hours, but therefore it could make the papers the next day. You'd be able to write your pieces, and you'd be able to just keep it for a few hours under your hat before it gets released to the world. So the days of Dave Rennie, the Australian coaches, are long gone. This is Joe Schmidt. Joe Schmidt didn't necessarily feel like he was obliged to do anything for the media when he was in Ireland. Certainly didn't do that when he was an assistant coach with the All Blacks. He didn't do a single media press conference, and he came over and he was told, fix Australian rugby. And at the same time, Joe Schmidt didn't want to do press conferences around the team announcement. He was convinced that he had to do that. So Joe Schmidt doesn't really have any time for the media, and that's all well and good. The thing is, if you don't start winning, and if you're not winning, then it can quickly backfire, those sorts of things. But on the question, forget about the media for the moment. The public doesn't care about the media. The public cares about rugby union. And if they don't care about rugby union, that's a bigger issue. And the fact that it is going out in the middle of the night, it doesn't allow for storytelling. It doesn't allow you to talk about the team around the players that are involved. It doesn't allow you to grow the game. So I think it's a very backwards way of thinking. And if you think about Steve Borthwick is increasingly announcing his team earlier in the week. Rassie Erasmus has done it continually at the start of match weeks, and they're the double World Cup winners. So you can think about it being coaching mind games. I think it's a backwards way of thinking.
Yeah, because even Ireland, like they're not the most media friendly team by any means. But like even if they were abroad, and I don't think even they would announce the team in the middle of the night. And it's funny you mentioned the earlier team announcements. Like Andy Farrell started his tenure doing that, and very quickly rode back to the traditional Thursday slot because yeah, I guess he didn't see the value in it, like so many other people. How do you find covering Joe Schmidt's Wallabies generally? Like you mentioned his relationship with the media in Ireland, where I don't know, he was pretty distrustful of the media. We were getting a sense that apparently it was a new Joe Schmidt, or certainly that he had softened. Maybe his style in Ireland wouldn't mesh well with Australian sensibilities, or maybe a more kind of carefree people, and we're maybe more used to that kind of strict structure. How have you found him working? How do the players find him as well? Like, how has the Joe Schmidt experience been over there, would you say?
I think people initially found him very refreshing in the sense that we've come from Eddie Jones for 1 year, 10 months or so that he was the Wallabies coach. And he said a lot. He said, when we beat the All Blacks, the New Zealand economy is going to sink. And that didn't happen. And I think the public to begin with didn't mind his upbeat, confident, brash style. But when the results didn't deliver and they only won 2 from 9 tests in 2023, they bombed out at the World Cup, of course. People thought, oh, Jesus, like put a sock in it. I'm sick of hearing you just talk. We want to see your actions on the field for once. And when Joe Schmidt came in, he described himself as being boring, as being pragmatic, as being a pragmatist, as not someone who's going to necessarily sell papers, but what I'll do is I'll do everything I can to elevate the standing of the Wallabies. I'm here. I think the public really gravitated to that. Me, on the other hand, I thought, this is going to be interesting because the Wallabies need a win. You need to put rugby on the back pages. This is a sport where the broadcast funding money at the moment per year is about $40 million Australian. That is about 10 times less than what it is in the NRL or the AFL per year. So it is a minor niche sport compared to these other sports. And you've got to fight tooth and nail for coverage. And we've got a coach here now who doesn't really care for the media. So I was initially like, oh, I'm not sure about this. And it's really fascinating that for the first 18 months, and especially off the back of the third test, beating the Lions, beating the Springboks at Ellis Park, people thought, wow, Joe Schmidt, Uncle Joe, he's done it again. But that narrative has shifted drastically over the last 6 weeks, and it's coupled by the fact that the Wallabies have won just 5 of their last 6 matches. So the pressure cooker, the spotlight is firmly on him now.
And what's your sense of the last 6 weeks, as you say? Like for me, I'm still, when I've watched every Australia game, I think Joe Schmidt is coach this year, but I didn't see the Fiji game, but I've watched all the other ones. Like, I'm definitely still a glass half full person, like of how they're going. I know that obviously the Italy result is a disaster. No, that's never going to be treated anything other than that, and rightly so. But I just feel like in terms of injuries and player availability, I just feel like the only time he probably had his best team available, closest to it, was probably the first test of that second lines test. Rob Valentini then got injured, and even then he was shorn of some of his heavy hitters. There's been so much chopping and changing. Some of that is his own selection, which has maybe never been his strongest suit, as good of a coach as he is. But I don't know. Are you glass half empty? Because I still think when I've seen them looking good this year, it's as good as they've looked probably since 2015 when they got to the World Cup final. Maybe I'm being over optimistic and I'm remembering Joe Schmidt from his high point in Ireland, but when I've seen them look good this year, I thought they've looked very good, and I kind of have some mitigation maybe for some of the poorer performances and results. What do you think?
I think there's a few things to consider. The first thing is that the Lions wasn't a great Lions team. Let's be frankly honest. It didn't have too many people where there you'd go, they are in a World 15. They are going to challenge a lot of the Springboks and All Blacks players for selection, the French players for selection. And they, the Irish side had obviously didn't win the Six Nations. The English team was probably on the rise, but they had a lot of players challenging for the, spots. Finn Russell was clearly the 10. And so I don't think it was a great Lions team. And I think the third test, they'd been on the drink just down the road from where I am in Sydney for 3 days. And so how much weight and stock you can put into that third test victory, I'm not sure. It's clearly a great scalp and it looks fantastic. But, Finn Russell was on his phone, in the lightning break. There wasn't any of that happening with the Wallabies, I'll tell you that. And then, the Springboks jumped out to a 22-0 lead after about 20 minutes, and I think they took the foot off the gas, didn't they? And they were shell shocked. And you've got to credit the Wallabies team for winning in South Africa. And even their next one or two performances were pretty good, including in Cape Town when they lost to South Africa. There was a couple of shots James O'Connor missed. But all along, I think you touched upon it, selection. I think the selection has left a lot to be desired, and it's been reactive selection. So, for instance, James O'Connor, is my understanding is he's going to wear the number 10 jersey against Ireland this weekend in Dublin. Now, Joe Schmidt did not want to call him up 5 months ago, and he didn't want to call him up just in the last week. I got told that he had a meeting with the leadership players on Sunday where he said, do we think we need James O'Connor back? And the players unanimously said yes. So he's come back, but he's going to wear the 10 jersey. He wasn't even with the squad last week in Italy. And if we scroll back a month ago, 5-6 weeks ago, before the test against New Zealand, Joe Schmidt once again did not want James O'Connor. So James O'Connor boards a flight to London on the Monday. He gets to London 24 hours later, and 24 hours after that, he's asked to come home. So he then, within the space of 5 days, has travelled around the world. He's dropped his dog off and his missus, but they would much rather be on the Gold Coast with their friends and family. Instead, they're there for a few extra weeks, and James O'Connor's come back on the Saturday. He has a pretty poor game 7 days later. And why? Well, maybe, just maybe, it's because of the poor communication from Joe Schmidt and the Wallabies coaching team, perhaps the CEO, not being aligned around what's the future of James O'Connor. And we can date this back right through to before the first Lions test. He was the last person told that he was in the Lions squad. It came off the back of the Noah Lolesio injury. Joe Schmidt didn't want O'Connor in there. All the squad was together on the Thursday night, the Friday morning. And Joe Schmidt basically left a message mid-morning on the Friday, an hour or two before the squad was announced, saying, "Hey mate, we're calling you up. Come on in." And he got notified by his teammates on the streets of Brisbane. So the communication all along has been poor, in my opinion. And then you think about how the Wallabies are playing at the moment. Well, they've hardly fired a shot for the last 3 or 4 test matches. Against Japan, they were lucky. They fell across the line, 19-15 winners. They had one intercept try against England at Twickenham. They didn't score another point. And then last weekend they scored 3 tries, 2 of which came from the front rowers. I think, and you listen to people like Matt Giddo, Drew Mitchell, Adam Ashley Cooper over the last few days have really talked about how narrow, how rudderless this Wallabies team, and you can see it. And then you go, well, hang on, but it's 13 tests through a marathon season. They're gassed. But then you listen to Ewan McKenzie last week, the former Wallabies coach, and Ewan's talking about, well, I think they're probably gassed because of the attritional game plan that this Wallabies team is playing. They're not using the width of the game, the field. They're not using their 2 biggest and best players, perhaps, in Max Jorgensen and Joseph Akusu-Suaalii, who are barely touching the ball. So I think there's a multitude of factors of why the Wallabies have only won 5 from 13 this year, and I don't think they reflect well on Joe Schmidt.
Yeah, I agree with a lot what you say there. And interesting you mentioned the attritional game plan, because that was definitely something people pointed to towards the end of the Ireland tenure, that it was such a taxing game plan. So many rucks needed to unlock an opponent that it just, I suppose, tired the team out and didn't ask massive questions potentially of opposition defences. 10 has been a huge problem for Australia all year. They've started 5 different out halves in 13 tests. That's crazy. And, Noah Lolesio obviously was first. He got injured against Fiji. But to be honest, I watch a lot of Super Rugby. The Australian games are at a perfect 11 o'clock kickoff time up here. So that's probably, I get to see pretty much every one of them. Never thought he was a great player, to be honest. So I didn't think maybe necessarily losing him was a big loss. But then it was Tom Lynagh, then James O'Connor, then Tane Edmed, then Carter Gordon, who, if I was Australian, I'd be happy for him to stay in Rugby League from what I've seen him play in Rugby Union. I think James O'Connor, I'm with you, I still think James O'Connor has a lot to offer. It's funny, I searched his name on Twitter earlier before this chat to see what people have been saying ahead of his selection. and not to toot my own horn, but a tweet I sent in February came up after he made his debut for the Crusaders, and I said, great to see him playing great again. Aligned bolter, question mark. So, as you say, it was well flagged that he was playing good rugby. Well flagged by experts such as myself, obviously, but maybe not everybody. And then to go to it so late in the day, and he made such an immediate impact when he came back in against South Africa, and then he was chopped and changed again. Like, he was out, he was in, as you mentioned, the kind of the farcical travel. Like, if you told me now that James O'Connor was going to be Australia's out half at the next World Cup, that wouldn't. I would be enthused about that. Honestly, I know he's old, but I actually think that would be an enthusiastic prospect for me of all the options. And if he'd actually been given this whole window to bed in more, to play more, I actually think Australia would be in a much better place than they are now.
I completely agree. I think there's a couple of things there. One, last year after the Georgia Test match in Sydney, Joe Schmidt said, look, and I asked him around the 10 situation, Ben Donaldson had just worn the 10 jersey and didn't set the world alight. Noah Lolesio had come off the bench. He'd kicked a ball dead in goal and therefore turned possession over. And it was another instance of a young 10 just not quite taking the opportunity. And I asked around, are you happy with what you've seen in the 10 stocks and over the last 3 test matches? Would you consider a James O'Connor or a Bernard Foley? And Joe said, I think eventually we've got to stop looking at those sorts of older guys because, are they going to be at the World Cup? Probably not. And if we keep turning away from these younger guys, there's going to be a fair bit of mental scarring, and they're going to struggle, and it will be a blow to their confidence. Well, we saw eventually Joe Schmidt kind of go back to the retreat mode. That's what Dave Rennie did with Bernard Foley. He did it with Quade Cooper, then Bernard Foley, and similarly, Joe Schmidt's done that. So I think there was a reluctance all along to go to James O'Connor. Now,
just to come in, Christy, because to be fair to Joe Schmidt, that's not an illegitimate opinion. To say, I want, James O'Connor is 35, it's time to look to the future. That's not, that's a fair line of thinking. Like, I don't agree with it, but I can understand his logic to give him some credit.
I can understand it too. The issue is that Tom Liner is not on the tour at the moment. He could be on the tour. There was when the initial media release came out to us about the squad, Tom Liner wasn't bracketed as an injured player. Now, I don't think he was injured. It was an excuse, I think, for him that he was so-called injured and therefore not on. And this is the guy that's worn the 10 jersey in all 3 Lions tests. He's starting test debut, and I thought he did a pretty good job considering the opposition. Now, he did get, unfortunately, a concussion against the Lions in the 3rd test, but he could have been fit after that point in time. He came back against Argentina, played poorly, and his stocks went fractionally down. Now, Ben Donaldson's been okay. He's been back fit after getting an injury in South Africa, and he's been thrown to the scrap heap, unfortunately. So there's been a few of these 10s where Joe Schmidt's actually gone, you know what, they're actually probably not as good as I thought. And now, possibly, that's fair enough. But I think the communication, the flip-flopping around who is the preferred 10 has been an absolute issue. But then you think about how James O'Connor's been treated. Now, I think he's been thrown to the wolves this weekend. He should have been with the squad last week against Italy. Like we're talking about Carter Gordon, who did okay in his comeback game, first rugby match in 18 months. He did all right, scored a try, probably shouldn't have been a try because Harry Wilson knocked the ball on. But what he showed was a line break, a couple of nice left kicks, even though he's a right footer, took the ball to the line. Now, he's still battling a quad issue, so I can understand James O'Connor coming back, but you've only got 2 10s in the squad to begin with. Why isn't James O'Connor in that squad? Why isn't he going in there with Len Ikitau and Tom Hooper last week? Even Ikitau didn't play last week to get up to speed. James O'Connor should have spent the week to get up to speed in case there was an injury. So it just does not make sense that you would now parachute the bloke in. And I think he's trying to set him up to fail, to go, you know what? You are 35. You're not going to get to the World Cup. Thanks for your service. I've tried that. We've really got to pin our hopes with the younger 10s, but I just don't know if they're up for it at the moment and whether or not they will get to it either. We've got to remember that all the best talent goes to rugby league. They get snapped up when they're 14, 15 years old. They all play rugby throughout their high school years as well. They go to prestigious private schools, but they're there on scholarships, and they get picked up by the NRL clubs. So the 10s that you're seeing that are coming through the system here in Australia, they're not necessarily the best tens that are going to end up playing rugby union. And that's the thing that's probably lost on maybe the British and the Irish and the French and the South African communities that love their rugby, that expect that the best tens are going to be playing for the Wallabies. It's just not the case now.
Yeah, I want to circle back to the rugby league point maybe towards the end, just about where union sits, because there's a few things you said. I agree with you. It's very haphazard. Like, I watched the Australia game against Italy on TV over here, and like James O'Connor was in the studio, like doing the punditry on it. Like, that's the fact that he's now starting against Ireland makes it look a real kind of ramshackle, haphazard decision. And like, just to go back to the rugby championship for a second, like, you know, O'Connor plays great in those two South Africa games, and then I was on the bandwagon. Like, I want to see Joe Schmidt and Australia do well, so I watched those two Argentina games, which were on at 5 and 5:30 a.m. So I really got up early to watch them as well. But like, he was on the bench for both of those games, and Australia made dreadful starts, got no direction. I think Tom Lynam was the started the first one, and Edmed started the second one, if I remember correctly. And O'Connor came off the bench and sparked these two great comebacks, one of which was successful and one of which fell almost just short. And like that showed me that, like, God, if he had been started, I think if he had started those two games, I think Australia would have won both of them arguably, and you know, the complexion would have looked a lot different. And I actually thought the game, O'Connor started the game away to New Zealand, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Yeah, and I thought that was a really good Australia performance. Like, Australia, you know, kind of obviously had a tricky start. I think they were 17-0 down, but they were the better team then for about 50 minutes. And then, to be fair, New Zealand, as they've done in a couple of games in the last quarter, like, maybe took control. But again, I was still very enthused at that point. You know, you mentioned kind of a few other guys like Glenn Ikitau, Tom Hooper, Will Skelton. What is the story with their availability generally? They were in, they were out. Like, I thought Skelton was meant to be available for the Rugby Championship, you know, due to player release. Was it a bit of horse trading with La Rochelle that they wanted to keep La Rochelle on side? Like, what exactly is the rules around that, and when can Australia use guys and not use guys? Because I was kind of confused as when I was reading maybe some of your articles, and you were kind of saying, oh, he might be back Skelton could be back for the second Bledisloe game, and I was just wondering why he couldn't just be playing the whole time.
But before I get there, one thing about James O'Connor is that test that you were describing about how well he performed against South Africa. I think he went off script. He started throwing long cutout passes, which Max Jorgensen ate it up for breakfast and loved it, and they scored tries, and it was the most stunning rugby the Wallabies have played all year. But I don't think that's Joe Schmidt's style and his game plan. He likes the short ball. He likes to manipulate defence and then put attackers away. So even though the public loved what they saw with James O'Connor, I don't think Joe Schmidt did. Now, on your point around Will Skelton, he is a man who probably marches to the beat of his own drum now, I think. You know, he's the guy that's the 33-year-old who's won European championships, the person that the Wallabies desperately need. And I think, you know, unfortunately, he knows it. And the Wallabies just accept when he's available or not. So you're right around the Regulation 9 windows. Like, he should have probably been playing or with the Wallabies last week against Italy. But unfortunately, he picks up an injury whilst playing Toulon because they had a make-up game because their previous match, which denied him being in New Zealand for the first Bledisloe test, was washed out, unfortunately. So he's in his own bracket compared to Lenny Katau and to Tom Hooper and to James O'Connor. Now, the law has completely changed, and every Wallabies coach makes up whatever narrative they want. You know, Michael Cheika brought it in. He said, you know what, I want Matt Giteau and I'll take Drew Mitchell along the way. So it was called the Giteau law. You previously couldn't pick from overseas. You know, then it changed to, you know, picking three guys. They had to have 30 caps of test experience or 5 years of service in Super Rugby. You know, that changed when Eddie Jones came in. And Eddie Jones said, I'm picking Richie Arnold, who's never played for the Wallabies, and he's playing up in France. I want him. And he picked him. And Joe Schmidt's gone, I'm always going to preference those that are in Australia in 50-50 scenarios. And if there's a person that is head and shoulders above someone else, like a Skelton, I'll just pick them. You know, Tom Hooper's just finished the Super Rugby season. He's going to be with Exeter for the next 2 years. But the hope and the expectation is that Australian Rugby will once again pick him up because they didn't offer him a compelling contract to stay because they didn't rate him that highly 12 months ago. Yet he had an outstanding, to me, he was in the top 2 Australian Super Rugby players this year. He was outstanding for the Brumbies. And they've gone, you know what, we need him. And similarly, Len Ikitau, who's decided I'll have a 9 months with Exeter. I'll make a bit of cash and I'll come back and I'll sign with the Brumbies on still a very compelling deal himself. So any player, it could be Rob Simmons, it could be Ray Simone who's playing in France, it could be Colby Feinger who spent years at Connacht. If there's a player that a Wallabies coach wants, they could get it now. But in the 50-50 scenarios, the expectation is that you'll favour the local base player, and that's to try to keep the integrity of Super Rugby. And even though the Super Rugby competition has lost a lot of stock over the years, the administrators are so scared of the broadcasters going, you know what, uh, you're not ensuring that the best talent is in Australia. We're going to rip up this contract because your Aussie sides aren't winning. And you know what? The Aussie sides aren't winning anyway. The last time an Australian Super Rugby side won was back in 2014. The last side, there hasn't been a team that's made the final since 2014. And so I think you'll see in the years to come Super Rugby explode because Australia will probably realise that it can't compete with the overseas market. It's already cash strapped. Rugby Australia can barely afford. They've now brought in the Waratahs and the Brumbies under their umbrella, and they can't really afford it. And that's why they're saying, even though they made millions and millions from the British and Irish Lions series, they paid off all the debt, they cashed a bit in the bank, they now realise that because they've brought the Waratahs and the Brumbies under their umbrella, they can't afford to sustain the game currently how it is. So there's going to have to be a huge circuit breaker in the next couple of years, probably post the World Cup in 2027, because Australian rugby, unfortunately, from a professional point of view, is struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah. Bleak enough picture you paint there. Just specifically on Skelton. So are you saying that it's Skelton making decision, I want to play for La Rochelle this weekend, I'm not going to play for Australia? Or who's making that decision?
He realises that it's La Rochelle that is paying him a lot of money, and I haven't got this for fact, and I haven't seen his contract, but I've heard suggestions that he gets docked money when he re-signed there not that long ago. He gets docked money when he leaves La Rochelle to go play for Australia, and he's not going to recoup that money for the Wallabies. So, it's here safe for now, but World Rugby has to really get a handle on this because there will be some players and some, South Africa has been pretty obvious for years that they're going to pick who they want. Australia has really changed its tune on how they're going to select players, and some clubs have started to cotton on to this and gone, you know what, well, we've signed you to play because we signed you under the proviso that you wouldn't be playing for Australia, that you'd be playing for La Rochelle. Now that, clearly Rugby Australia changes its tune on its eligibility criteria every 6 to 12 months. So, this is going to be putting into your, there'll be a little thing put into your contract, a sub clause or something. So it is fascinating, but he is probably the exception, not the rule.
Yeah, it's just I feel like in my mind's eye, if I see Australia having a big 2027 World Cup campaign, which I still think can happen, he has to be there. He has to be the totem. Like, we've seen what he can do. We're obviously as familiar as anybody with Will Skelton's prowess, given what he's done to Leinster in some big European finals. Even in that first half, as I mentioned, of that second test, him and Valentini dovetailing so well in the power game, it just unlocked another level that Australia can get to. He hasn't really, between availability and I suppose how his career just kind of unfolded, he hasn't really been at his best for the Wallabies. Obviously got injured in the 2023 World Cup when he was, the key guy for Eddie Jones, so he got robbed of it there. So yeah, I'm kind of always fascinated to see him when he's playing for Australia, to see if he can match what he does with La Rochelle in some of those big games. Just to go back to the Rugby League point you made, what we're kind of told over here, or the perception in Ireland, is that rugby union is by far and away behind rugby league, cricket, Aussie rules, maybe even soccer. It's really struggling for playing numbers. People don't really watch it that much on TV, that it's kind of hived off behind a paywall on Stan Sport, and it's not that accessible to the majority of the population. And that, ultimately that it's, as you said the word niche sport. Is that a fair representation of what rugby union is now like in Australia?
I previously worked at Fox Sports, and it was when Fox had it as a part of their bracket of sports, which is from NRL to AFL to cricket. it was described as the CEO, Patrick Delaney, as being a niche sport. And very soon after, they lost the broadcast rights there. Now, Stan will build it, pump it up, and they've done a good job pumping it up. But it is, unfortunately, it is a niche sport. So now like it doesn't mean that it is not one of the national teams. So a bit like the Australian cricket team over the summer, or the Socceroos when they're at a World Cup, or the Matildas, when the Wallabies win, people really embrace it. But unfortunately, the Super Rugby numbers have been horrendous, and it reflects the shift in rugby union, professional rugby union. There is a heartbeat, the clubland, from a shoot shield game to up in the Hospital Cup, right around the country. Club rugby is quite well supported, but there's a lot of people that, unfortunately, for whatever reason, and sometimes it's the administrators and what's happened. I think it's just because the lack of success, but there's been a real disconnect between clubland and the professional era. And unfortunately, those that go and watch club footy don't always go watch the Waratahs or the Reds, the professional team, play, and that's where they're really struggling at the moment.
Yeah, it's funny because it jumped out at me. I was doing a bit of traveling last year. I was in Osaka in Japan, and I wanted to watch Joe Schmidt's first rugby championship game against South Africa. It was at home. Yeah, it was a home one. And went into an Australian themed bar where it was being shown. And on the other screen, there was this NRL game, just a regular NRL game. And two Australian couples came in and were glued to the rugby league. I was watching the rugby union. And then one guy kind of looked over and was like, oh, what's on over there? Oh, is that the Wallaby? Oh, are they playing today? And it just kind of struck me, like, if there was an Ireland game, a big Six Nations game against France, we obviously don't have like the rugby league element, but like some, people would be aware of it more so. And it was just really jarring that the screens were side by side and these two couples were just so engrossed in their rugby league match. And there was AFL on another screen actually, and those guys were really engrossed in that and were barely even giving a passing glance to the Wallabies Springboks, which I would have thought would be, a major match. So I thought that was just an interesting insight into maybe the Australian sporting public's affections. Is the rugby league playing numbers like vastly larger than rugby union there? Is it like, I know it's as you mentioned, bigger supported, the TV deal is a lot bigger. Is there just like a lot more people playing rugby league generally as well?
I can't tell you the figures off the top of my head, but my understanding is they're pretty similar.
Okay.
Very similar, in fact. But the issue is that because of all the money that's now in the rugby league and in the NRL and the AFL, talent scouts are much more proactive as 14 and chasing the 14 or 15-year-olds. So that's the real shame in all of this, is that there's so many players that you think that could really succeed from a 15 man and 15 woman point of view, and from the professional end, the top tier players might earn similar sort of money, but the opportunities aren't there either. There's 4 super sides now, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. But when all the best talent isn't necessarily funneling into those 4 sides, well, then your talent identification has to be absolutely spot on. And I don't think it has been. Now, there's been some good signs recently. Some of the 16s and 18s results have been good. The Aussie schoolboys, the Australian under-18s team rather, just beat and hammered the New Zealand school side on consecutive weekends just over the last month. But New Zealand is also actually now starting. They might have been a bit complacent themselves, and there's some serious questions being asked of New Zealand rugby about, have they been proactive enough? The New Zealand Warriors in the NRL has started to gain a lot of traction. The NBA is massive down in Australia and New Zealand now. And it's not necessarily that every kid wants to play for the All Blacks now, where that was the case 10 to 20 years ago. So even though the results have started to look a bit positive from a junior perspective in Australia, I do think you have to look at what's happening over at New Zealand to see whether or not they're in the healthy, strong position that they once were, and I'm not sure if they are.
Yeah, and just on the rugby league point again, like obviously like Joseph Suaalii, one of those big name players who was tempted across on a huge deal. And you look back in when Australia last hosted the World Cup, like Eddie Jones' team in 2003, like they had Lottie Takiri, Wendell Saylor, Matt Rogers, kind of big NRL names. But like, I do question the wisdom of giving Joseph Suaalii such a large contract when, as you say, there's other guys around the world now. If you could take that money and spread it across Tom Hooper, Len Nicotell, other guys to coax them all back into Australia, that might be a better long-term strategy than having one marquee signing. I don't know what you think, because Joseph Suaalii, he's been eye-catching, but I'm not sure if he's been transformative. Perhaps on eyeballs he has been in Australia because he's obviously very famous there, but I wonder actually could the money have been used in a different way to maybe solidify Australian rugby? I don't know. Maybe that's just wishful thinking.
It's probably fair thinking. A lot of people thought that. I think the reality of what we saw is Phil Ward, the Rugby Australia CEO, I think was aligned with your thinking, even though he was at the dinner that helped seal the deal to Joseph Suaalii to come across and jump across to rugby union. He wanted to renege on that deal in the couple of months before Suaalii came. It's been reported. My understanding is accurate. He wanted to get out of that deal, but in the 6 months after that, Phil Ward went on the record and said, you know what, it's been a good deal, and it was an effective deal because Suaalii, will get 500 more mentions than any other player in Australian rugby. He's the sort of generational talent, has played rugby league, that people understand that this guy can play. I don't think, but a lot of people have thought he's gone backwards since being with the Wallabies over the last 12 months. When he arrived at Twickenham against England in the shock to the world, Australia beat England. Suaalii was, named player of the game. I don't know if he should have, but it was one of the most breathtaking debuts. Now, but this was after 2-3 weeks of coaching, and since he's been overcoached, perhaps, he's not nearly been as effective. So people were asking, well, is this a rugby union issue? And it could be. So, look, clearly $1.6 million would go a hell of a long way to snapping up some of the younger kids. But to do that, you've got to win. And the Wallabies have to win. Suaalii was effective against the Springboks. He made that intercept and they scored the try. That was a huge play when they beat the Boks. And that generated a couple of weeks of media attention. I would think with the 2 years leading up to the World Cup, we're coming up to the pointy end of the World Cup in 2 years' time, almost to the day. They're not going to do it, but one or two extra rugby league stars could be phenomenal. And I'll tell you what, R360, nations around the world have said, we're not going to pick you if you play from R360. Well, Rugby Australia in the next 6 months may well change their tune around that if they see rugby league stars like Ryan Papenhuyzen, Payne Haas suddenly come onto the rugby market, because these sorts of players undoubtedly could make a massive difference to what the Wallabies are on a home soil World Cup in 2 years, which could literally quite make or break where rugby union goes for the next 20 years, the direction of the game.
Oh, that would be an unbelievable win. If 4-3-60 were footing the bill for these big names and in Australia could just pick them, that would be like Phil Wall would be definitely going out for another dinner of celebration if that was the case. Last thing, Christy, I really appreciate you joining me. Really fascinated to get a good insight into where Australia are at. So Joe Schmidt is contracted up, I think, until next summer. So he'll be doing the summer tests next year, I believe, and then handing off to Les Kiss, if I'm correct in that. Obviously, I think Ireland are due to go to Australia then. So, is there any possibility of him staying on to the World Cup, would you reckon? Is there any, or is he definitely leaving? Is there any possibility of him, maybe like he did with New Zealand in 2023, being like a senior coach with Les Kiss as the head coach? I suppose the momentum behind that maybe coming to pass has probably dissipated a small bit with the results, but certainly there was a clamour for it, maybe, I would say, after they'd beaten the Springboks. But, what's the future there? What's that handover going to look like ultimately as we look towards the World Cup?
Well, I think if the Wallabies don't win one of the next two tests, I reckon there's more chance that Joe Schmidt finishes up by the end of the year rather than next July. A lot of people are going, what's the point of this handover? He's going to be with the Wallabies for 3 tests. Of course, we don't have the Six Nations. The Rugby Championship's not played at the start of the year yet. What's Rugby Australia paying someone pretty good money to stay on the books for another 7-8 months when he's got 3 tests in charge? Especially if the Wallabies only end up winning 5 from 15 for the year. It'd be 33%. So, look, at the moment, Les Kiss is due to there's going to be this coaching transition. Les Kiss will come in next July. He'll be with Joe Schmidt for those 3 tests, including against Ireland. And then it'll be Kiss's side. I can't see, I think at one point in time, and maybe still today, there'd be people within Rugby Australia that would have hoped that Joe Schmidt stayed on. through to the World Cup. I can't see that happening now. The results simply haven't been good enough. The mood has shifted, and unless there's a significant result over the next 2 weeks, I think it's Buckley's chance of Joe Schmidt being with the Wallabies this time next year. Certainly, even maybe by Christmas, because what's the point? Les Kiss, if anyone watches how Queensland play rugby, it's chalk and cheese compared to how the Wallabies are playing. Les Kiss plays a very attacking brand of rugby, full width of the field, complete bind with the players that have leaked points. Joe Schmidt's narrow, playing 21 kind of balls with working the angles, breakdown emphasis. It's completely different to what we're seeing with Les Kiss. So the other thing that people are going in the background is, well, what's Les Kiss won? And realistically, he's not won anything. He's not reached finals either. So I don't think a lot of people will be desperate to hand over to Les Kiss, because there's huge amount of skepticism around whether or not he's the right person to take over. The reality is he is. I think the current Wallabies team might be playing more effectively under a Les Kiss coach side than currently the Joe Schmidt side that he's got at the moment.
And potentially there's a parallel between Joe Schmidt with Ireland, when he got the team to a certain level, was able to drill them to a certain degree, but they required maybe a more looser presence than Andy Farrell to unlock another level. Maybe Les Kiss can achieve the same thing with the Wallabies. Christy, thank you so much for joining me. I really wanted to talk to you about Eddie Jones and the car crash that was 2023. We might save that for another time, because I'd just be fascinated to know what that was like, just working in Australian rugby at the time. But we'll save that for now. Enjoy the game. Hope you don't have to get up for this press conference tonight overnight. But if you do, fair play to you. That's good journalism. Thanks so much for joining me. All the best.
Thanks very much. I know I've been quite down. What I'll say is that the last 4 matches that Australia has played in Dublin, they've lost by 3 points. So even though the history suggests and the current history suggests they might struggle, history over the last 10 years suggests it will be a very, very close game. I hope it is.
Yeah,
enjoy.
So do I. And I actually think my glass is half full. I'll be interested to see what they're like come the 2027 World Cup. We'll definitely try to have you on before then anyway. So thanks so much.
Cheers.